This is your host, Danny, and this is English Plus, a podcast by Plus Podcast Network. Subscribe to Plus Podcast Network on Apple Podcasts to have access to all our premium shows, or become a patron of English Plus on Patreon and have access to all the same shows on our website, EnglishPlusPodcast.com. You can find the links to both Apple Podcasts and our Patreon page in the description of this episode. Today, we're going to talk about common mistakes. And I called that moving around because we're going to talk about some mistakes when we talk about things away from home, when we talk about travel here and there, or the outside world. So I will start the episode by talking about common mistakes we make when we use the words stranger, foreigner, usual, common, strange, or foreign. Let me give you the first example, and I want you to think, and maybe even pause the episode and think about the mistake, whether there is a mistake or not. But let me tell you that all of the examples I'm going to use have mistakes, or at least they have something that is not usually said this way. But I want you to think about the mistake and why it is a mistake. And before learning it from me, try to think about it yourselves. So you can pause the episode and think about it before you listen to my explanation. So without further ado, let's start with the very first example. It was interesting to have class discussions with other strangers. What do you think? Well, the problem here obviously is the word strangers. Now, strangers are people you've never met before. People of other nationalities are not called strangers. Maybe they are strangers, yes, maybe they are strangers, and you mean by that these are people you've never met before. But that doesn't mean that they are foreigners. Foreigners are people of other nationalities. We call them foreigners. Now, strangers can be from the same country, can be from the same hometown, but you've never met them before. But I would have to advise you not to use it unless it is really necessary, because this is often used negatively. The word foreigners. So avoid it when you can. To some point, sometimes it is even considered discriminatory, so you wouldn't want to use it. It's like discrimination and stuff. But here, we're just talking about the language. So the mistake was the word strangers. We wouldn't use strangers here, we would use foreigners. Now for the next example. John is a very usual name in Britain. What's wrong with this sentence? What's wrong with usual? It is a usual name in Britain. John is a very usual name in Britain. Well, there's a problem with that. For many examples of something, we use common, not usual. Now, usual is used more to talk about a routine or something that is done habitually, so we say it is a usual thing. But when we talk about something that has many examples, we have a lot of that thing, we use common, not usual. So, John is a very common name in Britain, not usual. And now let me give you another example because, we use stranger and foreigner. The same goes for strange and foreign. So, for example, you can't say there were a lot of strange students in my class because something strange is something that is not normal and makes you uncomfortable. But students that are from other countries are called foreign students, okay? Like foreigner, foreign students. So there were a lot of foreign students in my class. Now, that being said, let's move on to talk about some common mistakes when we want to talk about travel. The words like travel, journey, trip, tour, street, road, and flight. So our first example is I love travel. What's wrong with that? Well, I have to tell you that there's nothing wrong grammatically with this, but it is not a natural way of saying this exact expression. I love travel. So what would you say? We don't usually say that. When you are speaking generally, it's more common to say, I love traveling, not I love travel. Although I said grammatically it's correct, but usually people say, I love traveling, because you're talking about traveling in general. So that was the first one. That is, I wouldn't consider a real mistake, but not a natural way of using the word travel or traveling. Which one should we use? I love traveling, not I love travel. That's more natural. What about the second example? I'm going on a business travel next week. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with using travel in the sentence? Well, travel is uncountable without an A. So you can go on or make a journey, but not a travel. Travel is uncountable. If you go and come back after a short time, it is called a trip. So here the problem is a little more grammatical, and to be honest, here, because you're talking about a place where you're going for a short time and you're coming back, so we usually call it a trip, not travel. But again, the problem here is that we don't say a business travel because travel is uncountable. We use it without a. So if you want to say, I'm going on business travel, that's kind of awkward. Nobody said that. I haven't heard that before. But I'm going on a business trip next week. That's more like it. That's the way to go. And here, of course, you can use a business trip because trip is countable. Now for the next example. We went on a journey round the city by bus. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with the word journey? Well, the problem here that we don't use the word journey if we want to talk about visiting a lot of different places by bus. That is called a tour, not a journey. So instead of saying we went on a journey around the city by bus, we should say we went on a bus tour around the city. See that? We went on a journey around the city by bus. That's not natural. That's wrong. We went on a bus tour around the city. That's the way to go. Now for the next example. The streets between Oxford and Bath are beautiful. What's wrong with that? Is there anything wrong with the word streets here? Here the problem with using the word streets that streets are in towns and villages with houses on them. Now, between towns, where there are no houses, those roads connecting towns together are called roads, not streets. So here, because I'm talking about between Oxford and Bath, we're not talking about streets. There is no street between Oxford and Bath. There is a road. So the roads between Oxford and Bath are beautiful, not the streets. But remember, the streets is not wrong. You can use the streets when you want to talk about those streets in towns or villages, usually with houses on them. All right? So here, instead of saying the streets between Oxford and Bath are beautiful, we say the roads between Oxford and Bath are beautiful. Now for our next example. Did you have a good voyage? Well, what do you think is wrong with that? If there is anything wrong with it. Well, I have to tell you, there is nothing wrong with that. Nothing at all. But the word voyage is an old-fashioned word for long journeys by ship. And because the meaning is long journeys by ship, you can see why it is not usually used when you want to say this sentence to somebody who just arrived by plane or by car, whatever, but surely not by ship and not for a long time. Even by ship doesn't take a long time nowadays. So instead of saying voyage, which is an old-fashioned word, we use journey or flight. Now we say, did you have a good journey or a good flight? Now obviously flight if the person arrived by plane. If not by plane, you can use journey, but not voyage. Voyage is old-fashioned, long journeys by ship, which nobody takes anymore, unfortunately, because I would love to go on a long journey by ship. I would love to have a good voyage, but unfortunately, we don't have that anymore. And now let's talk about some common mistakes we use when we talk about the outside world with words like nature, the country, landscape, scenery, camping, campsites, shadow, and shade. That's next. So our first example, I love going for walks in nature. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with using nature in this sentence? Well, nature is the world of plants and animals that biologists study. If you love fields and trees, you go for walks in the country, not in nature. You say, I love going for walks in the country. That is because you love fields and trees and green. That is, you love going for walks in the country, not in nature. Now for the next example. The landscape in the Lake District is very beautiful. Well, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with using the landscape? Well, to be honest, there is nothing wrong with using the landscape in this example, but it is not natural to use it like that in this sentence. Landscape is normally used by artists or geographers. When you go to the country, for example, you enjoy the beautiful scenery, not landscape. So that is the word we usually use. We say the scenery in the Lake District is very beautiful, not the landscape. Although I said the landscape is a correct word, but it is not natural. It sounds awkward. The word to use in this example is the scenery. And now for our next example. We found a camping near the town. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with the word camping? Well, obviously, the word camping itself, we go camping, we went camping, that is fine. But when we want to talk about a place to put a tent, we call that a campsite. So we found a campsite near the town. Not we found a camping. We went camping near the town, that's fine, that's totally fine. But not we found a camping. We found a campsite, which is one word, by the way. And now for another example. I sat outside in the shadow. Think about that if you want to talk about it, for example, on the beach. If you're on the beach, you can say, I sat outside in the shadow. Well, what's wrong with that? There is obviously something wrong with that. There is something wrong with the word shadow. We don't use shadow here. Now, a shadow is made by your body and your hand and is too small to sit in anyway. If it is too hot, you don't sit in the shadow of somebody. You sit in the shade, and that is made by something bigger, like a building or a tree, for example, or a big umbrella maybe. But that is what we call the shade. Because you want to protect yourself from the sun, you sit in the shade. You say, I sat outside in the shade. Now, by the way, you can use shadow like to be in somebody's shadow, but that doesn't have anything to do with the sun or protecting yourself from the sun. That has a deeper meaning. If you live in somebody's shadow or if you are in somebody's shadow, that means you are not being noticed because of this person. And especially when this person is a family member and he or she gets all the attention and you are maybe as good or even better than that person, but because he or she is the person who gets all the attention, you are not noticed and you are in the shadow of that person or you live in the shadow of that person. So that is a totally different meaning. But here, protecting yourself in the sun, a sunny day, you don't want to get sunburned, so you go find yourself a nice, cool place in the shade, not in the shadow. And finally, let's talk about some other common mistakes we use with words like by car, on foot, come to, arrive at, in front of, or opposite. That's next. So, our first sentence is she goes to work with her car. What's wrong with that? Can you imagine going to work with your car? You walk side by side and I don't know who's pushing the car. Maybe you are, but you are definitely not in the car. You're not driving the car because that is the meaning of going to work with your car, like a friend or something. But if you want to say that you use the car, you drive the car to work, you don't say she goes to work with her car. You say she goes to work by car. That means she drives to work. So by car, not with her car. Her car is her best friend maybe, I don't know, maybe she talks to her car, maybe she doesn't, but that doesn't mean that she can go to work with her car. She goes to work by car. And by the way, we say by car, not by her car. So you don't use by the car or by her car or by, you don't use determiners. You just say by car, period. That's it. And now for the next sentence. You can get to the hotel by foot. Well, fine, no problem. I just gave you a lecture about not with and use by, etc. What's wrong with that? By foot, that's fine. No, it's not. Unfortunately, it's not. You cannot go to the hotel by foot or anywhere else for that matter. The problem is by foot. You don't go by foot. You go on foot. Yes, you go by car, by plane, by bus, by train, but on foot. You can get to the hotel on foot. And when we say you can get to the hotel on foot, it's like I'm telling you that it's not far. You can walk there. So that is the meaning of on foot. But remember, by car, by plane, but on foot. Now for the next example. I hope you'll come in Spain soon. Maybe I live in Spain, you live somewhere else, and I'm saying that. I hope you'll come in Spain soon. What's wrong with that? Come in or come another preposition? Well, obviously that's the problem. You can come and go in a room or house. That's fine. Come in the room or come in the house. That's fine. But like when we meet people at the door, we tell them come in. And because that's totally normal to say come in a room or a house. But when you travel to a country or town. So you use to, not in. I hope you'll come to Spain soon. Not in Spain. Spain is not a room or a house. I hope you'll come to Spain soon. Now for the next example. She arrived to the office late. Very good. You just told us about to. Don't use in, use to. So that's fine, right? No, unfortunately, it's not. You can never arrive to a place. It's impossible. We never use that. You can arrive in places or at places, but here we will talk about the difference. You can arrive in a town or a country, but you can use at if you want to talk about other places. So if you want to talk about Spain, for example, you use in. You say she arrived in Spain, okay? But if you want to talk about places, like in our example here, she arrived to the office late, we say she arrived late at the office. At, because the office is a place. Like when we say a restaurant or any small place, that is not a town and not a country. So if you're talking about a city, a country, a town, you use in. Now for our next and final example for this episode, there is a cinema in front of my house. What's wrong with that? Well, grammatically, there's nothing wrong with that, to be honest. But the meaning is so weird. I mean, if there is a cinema in front of your house and you are really confident about the use of in front of your house, and it is true, that means someone decided to build their cinema right in front of your house, so it is blocking the view. You can't see anything. You have no access to the street anymore. That's the meaning of in front. But if you mean that there is a cinema on the other side of the road, which is probably what is meant in this sentence, you don't use in front of, you say opposite. There's a cinema opposite my house. But again, don't get me wrong. Sometimes there can be a cinema or another store or whatever in front of your house, and that's bad because it's blocking the view, the air, everything. But normally the situation is not like that, especially we're talking about a house here, so houses usually don't have anything in front of them, usually. So here, again, if we're talking about a cinema on the other side of the road, we use opposite. So we say there's a cinema opposite my house. That's all for today, folks. Thank you very much for listening to another episode from English Plus, a podcast by Plus Podcast Network. And let me remind you, you can subscribe to Plus Podcast Network on Apple Podcasts. You can take the link you can find in the description, subscribe to get access to all our premium shows. Or if you don't have access to Apple Podcasts, you can become a patron of English Plus on Patreon and get the same access to all the premium shows on our website, EnglishPlusPodcast.com. That being said, this is your host, Danny. Thank you very much for listening to another episode from English Plus. I will see you next time.